What is going on, everybody? Today I'm teaming up with the Resilient Training Lab coaches Paul Milano and Ryan Kilkowski to talk about whether or not your lifting technique is leading you down to the road to getting injured. And make sure you stay to watch the whole video because the answer might surprise you. The notion that there is really well-defined good and bad lifting technique, and that lifting with bad lifting technique makes you more prone to getting injured, has been something that's passed down from coaches and medical professionals for years and years. Really common examples of this are rounding your back when squatting or deadlifting and letting your knees come in towards the midline, also known as knee valgus during squats. Unfortunately, this classification of good and bad lifting technique is a bit of a false dichotomy, and this is because human movement is extremely variable. People move in many different ways, and the same person moves differently depending on the context. In fact, this has even been studied in the context of weightlifting. And you guys know that I love my studies, so we're actually about to go over a couple. A study by Christensen in 2019 actually looked at the differences in movement between and within 10 competitive weightlifters during 6 trials at 90% of their 1 rep max for the back squat. Unsurprisingly, they found that each individual weightlifter moved differently than the others. However, they also found that each individual weightlifter had differences in how they move between each of the trials. This shows that not only do people move differently than other people, but the same person will move differently depending on time, trials, and context. Another study by Pavlova in 2018 looked at how 30 healthy and pain-free people with different shapes of the lumbar spine, different shape means more or less lordotic curve, picked up a 15 kilogram box from the floor under 3 different conditions. The 3 conditions were when they were either told no verbal instruction, when they were told to pick up in a squat style, or when they were told to pick up with a stooped back manner. What they found is that people with a greater lordotic curve actually preferred to stoop over to pick up the box, whereas people with a smaller or lesser lordotic curve tended to squat down to pick up the box when they were not giving any verbal instruction. This again just shows that different people move differently than other people, and this is likely multifactorial in nature. Next, even though some of you may not want to hear this, some classic examples of bad lifting technique might actually be unavoidable at times or potentially even helpful during lifting. A kinematic study by Potvin actually showed that while squatting and attempting to keep a neutral spine, there's up to 40 degrees of lumbar flexion at the various lumbar spinal segments. Another study by McGill actually showed that when you're doing a kettlebell swing and trying to maintain a neutral spine, there's up to 26 degrees of lumbar flexion. And finally, it's been theorized that some knee valgus may actually be a beneficial thing while squatting heavy loads. Many people now think this way because we know that the glute muscle group can't contribute that well to hip extension coming out of the hole in the squat. So we now think that the adductor muscle group, specifically the adductor magnus, is likely the primary hip extensor for coming out of a squat. So what this means is that when you're in a squat and we see some knee valgus during that position, it's likely the result of a strong contraction of the adductor muscle group to extend you out of the bottom of the squat. Really, when it comes down to it, different lifting techniques simply load different parts of our body more than other techniques. Having some knee valgus while you squat likely loads the medial compartment of the knee a little bit more, whereas experiencing some lumbar flexion while squatting or deadlifting likely loads different parts of the spine a little bit more. However, it has to be noted that just because something loads or stresses something more, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad, because that more is very ambiguous and really doesn't take into account how ready or how prepared that person is to handle that load or stress. For example, if somebody's 1 rep max for the deadlift is 225 pounds, which I'm sad to say is probably about my 1 rep max right now since I haven't touched a heavy barbell in like 8 weeks, and they attempt to pick up a 200-pound barbell with a really flexed lumbar spine, they might not yet be prepared to handle that load in that position, and they may get hurt or experience pain. However, if somebody's deadlift max is 600 pounds and they attempt to pick up a 200-pound barbell with a pretty rounded lumbar spine position, they might be perfectly fine because they can likely handle that amount of stress in that position. Further, it's likely a lot more important that you lift with as consistent a lifting technique as you can than is trying to fit into an arbitrarily good example of lifting technique if that technique doesn't suit you and your body as well as it should. Training with a really consistent technique will ensure that you're stressing the same structures relatively consistently and progressively over time. This will help ensure that those structures develop a tolerance to this stress and get stronger and more capable of handling the load that you place upon them. So if lifting technique is likely less important for injury risk than we once thought it was, what is really well correlated with an increased risk of injury? Reviews by Eckert et al. And Jones et al. show that high training loads and sudden increases in training load are correlated with an increased risk of injury. This, in essence, really goes back to how prepared you are to handle your training and your training load. With chronically high training loads or sudden increases in an athlete's training load, you likely overshoot their capabilities and increase their risk of getting injured. Another study by Iverson et al. Shows that many psychosocial factors, such as mental and emotional stress and anxiety, are correlated with an increased risk of getting injured. So when working with athletes and weightlifters, we really want to make sure that we're not only minding the program and that person's physical capabilities, but we're also taking these psychosocial elements into account. Next up, Paul and Ryan are going to go a little bit more in depth about the role of technique with movement efficiency and coaching.
So when people start to lift weights, everybody is very concerned about their technique and there's a right way to do a certain thing. And you see it all over Instagram, all over the internet, in all the magazines. It's like, don't do it this way, you'll get hurt, or you have to lift this way, or something bad will happen. And I think that is the wrong message to send, and the research doesn't exactly back that message up. When we're looking at lifting techniques, we're more concerned about what is most efficient for the lifter in front of us or the person in front of us, not what is more or less dangerous. Because when we do look at the research that Ryan Van is kind of diving into, you can see that there's not a lot of linkage between doing an exercise a certain way and getting hurt. It's more about kind of doing too much too soon or doing an exercise that you weren't prepared for. So when we're working with someone and trying to work with their technique, we're trying to find the ways that are most efficient for them to move the most amount of weight so we can drive as much adaptation as possible. Because if that person's able to use more weight on a specific lift, they're going to get more stimulus and they're going to get more adaptation out of that lift than they would if they were using less weight. So we're really searching for the way that that person can move the most amount of weight. And that's going to look different from person to person because everyone's built differently.
So along the same line, if the technique that we're choosing to complete a certain lift is supposed to be efficient, we can also put ourselves in specific positions to increase our strength where we might not necessarily be as strong. So we can change the way that we're doing a squat or the way that we're doing a deadlift to create a leverage that's going to help us in our weakest position so that hopefully it's no longer our weakest position. So this just doubles back to being efficient. We can change our technique and our leverages in order to help us continue to progress and push more loads so that we're driving more adaptation over time.
I think oftentimes this idea gets perpetuated because we see videos online of people, going for max attempts, lifts, and getting hurt. And there's two things at play here, and I think one of them is sometimes in these videos, these people have a shift in technique, and you kind of see that, and that leads to their injury, or it seems like it leads to their injury. And then there's also this other thing at play where you're looking at this idea of performance versus safety. And in all these videos, these athletes tend to be pushing themselves to their max capacity, going for max lifts or new records or something that they've never attempted before. And that probably has a much larger role in their injury than their technique did. So when you're going for a max effort lift, your technique is going to change a little bit just because of the amount of weight you're trying to move. And when you're pushing yourself to your maximum capabilities, you're going to have a higher risk for injury just from the very nature of pushing your body to its limits. So there's definitely some balance between how hard you push and safety, but I don't think technique plays as big of a role as we think it does, which brings me to that second point is we see this shift in the technique that we think leads to the injury, but usually it's because they are moving into a position that they are not as prepared to handle load in. We want technique to be very repeatable, and we want it to be the same over and over again so that you build strength in that exact motion so that when you're going for max lifts, you're working through that motion that you have the most strength in. Sometimes when we fall out of this position, that could lead to injury.
So with so many different options for our technique, a really common concern is how to find the right technique for you. And really the only way to do this is to try it. So what you might find is that somebody spends a lot of their time deadlifting conventional, and over the course of several training blocks or years of training, they might find that they actually have a higher ceiling in sumo and switch stances. And the only reason that they know this is because they made changes to their technique and it ended up working out in their favor. So if we're looking for efficiency and technique and we're looking for really high performance, all we have to do is make small little changes over time that hopefully will increase the efficiency of our lift, and we see if it works or if it doesn't. And so we can do complete overhauls, which is going to be a lot more work, like rebuilding a bench press, or we can do subtle changes like tweaking foot position or tweaking hand position on a bench that might yield small changes with a little bit less time invested into changing the technique.
So when it comes down to it, humans are people that learn by kind of trial and error, and when you're first starting to lift, your lifts are going to look completely different rep to rep. You're going to have lots of variation between the lifts, and as you get more advanced, we're going to see this variation kind of dwindle down and get a little more consistent. And that's really what we're looking for, is for someone to kind of start to feel things out when they're beginning to lift and start to figure out which reps feel the best. And then as a coach, we're there to kind of help them figure out why that rep felt better than the one before or worse than the one before, and start to piece together the things that are working for that person so that they can help find what works for them and feels the best for them kind of on their own, and we're just kind of a guide on that journey, because everyone's technique's going to look a little bit different, and there's going to be some basic things that we're looking for, and most of that revolves around, you know, staying tight and rigid and repeating the same technique over and over again. So we don't want to be forcing people into certain techniques because, you know, trainer X or somebody who holds some world record squats a certain way. We want to try and let the person find what works best for them and help them repeat that over and over again and build strength in that position. So we were talking about how there's a lot of variation when you first start lifting rep to rep, and as you get more advanced, we want to see this variation from rep to rep get smaller and smaller so that you're repeating the same technique over and over again. But what happens oftentimes is as people fatigue, their form changes and they get very worried about that, and they get worried about whether or not they're going to get hurt. And when you start to fatigue, your form is bound to change. From set to set, as you get more and more tired, your body's going to find ways to complete the task, and it's going to, if your lower back's super fatigued, it's going to switch into kind of a more quad dominant squat to get the same movement accomplished with whatever it has left. So our bodies are super efficient at trying to find ways to accomplish the task. So there is going to be some variation from set to set, and that's okay, and that's kind of something that we want to take into consideration when we're training. And we want to be performing movements in various planes of movements and various positions to build strength in different positions, so that if we get caught in these other positions that we have the ability to tolerate load in those positions.
Yeah, and having the ability to complete the same task in a lot of different ways can be very valuable outside of the gym as well. I think the easiest example to illustrate this is if we have to pick something up off the ground and we can't quite hinge because of our flare-up of our back pain or for whatever reason, we would be accomplishing this task in a much more squatty movement pattern. And then the opposite would hold true. If we're having a lot of knee pain, we might need to hinge over more and bend over more and maybe place a little bit more stress on our back to accomplish the task, because whether or not we're feeling 100%, we're still going to have to pick things up off the ground. We're still going to have to move around in our daily life or possibly in our job. So the more ways that we can accomplish a task, or the more tools that we have in a toolbox to complete a task, the higher the likelihood we'll have of being successful. Something we see a lot of in the gym that might not necessarily be the most ideal is over cueing. So if somebody's performing a lift and their coach is maybe yelling 4 or 5 things at them throughout the lift, the client or the athlete is going to be so focused on what the coach is saying that it takes their attention away from putting in 100% of their effort into moving the weight. And so it's really common to see, newer coaches shouting at their athletes, and it's actually something that athletes perceive as value in a coach, where the more that the coach is telling them while they're lifting, the better the training session is. When in reality, a lot of that will detract from their performance and hinder their progress over time.
Yeah, and that's not how we humans actually learn. So while you're performing the task, you're focused on performing the task. And if you're able to kind of respond to cues, then you're probably not working hard enough to, push adaptation, and you need to be adding more weight or more reps so that, you have to fully put your effort into what you're doing. And we need to kind of make mistakes to learn and to feel what positions are strongest and what positions are not so strong. And when we are overly concerned about, kind of what everyone around us is saying, we can't really tune into how the lift is really feeling. So we kind of lose a lot of opportunity to learn. So in the short term, it might feel like you're doing better because you're kind of making these changes the coach is saying right off the bat. But in the long term, those changes aren't going to stick because you're not actually, learning and putting those feelings into your brain and kind of storing them for a later date. So you're kind of hindering your long-term learning, even if it feels like in the short term you're doing better. And furthermore, as a coach, we claim to be able to see these minute changes in people's movement, but then when we really look at it, under a controlled setting, we have very, very poor capabilities of seeing the little things that are going on. We're good at seeing gross movement patterns, but when we look at the minute details, we don't really see the things we think we see. So there's been studies that show people doing things like a hinge and a swing or a squat, and they're told to do it in an extended posture. It looks as they're doing it in an extended posture, but then when you actually put measurements on their spine that are a little more sensitive to minute movements, you see that they're actually going into flexion even if they're trying not to. So we're not really good at seeing these things, so it's probably best that we kind of let the person learn on their own, and then we help cement the things that were working for them.
So if we think about rounding our back or spinal flexion, let's say for a second that spinal flexion is a dangerous position that we want to avoid. If we were to drop our phone on the ground, we would only be able to pick it up by performing our deadlift setup and perfectly, quote unquote, perfectly hinged to pick our phone up. But a lot of times the people who are talking about spinal flexion being dangerous aren't willing to do that when they pick up their phone. So at what point do we cross that threshold of that is no longer the technique that we want to use to pick up an object off the ground? So if we pick up a phone that might weigh 1 pound, it's okay to round our back. If we pick up our purse or our backpack, that's okay, that might weigh 10 to 15 pounds. At what point do we cross that threshold into now we shouldn't be rounding our back? And if we look at context, that's not always going to be the case. We might want to round our back to train that spinal flexion position. And so there are some instances where this can be really advantageous.
Yeah, so when you're looking at a gymnast or a dancer who has to perform all sorts of different movements and put their bodies in different positions and be strong in those positions, you watch a gymnast perform a bar routine, they're literally in flexion the whole time, holding that hollow body position. So they need to be strong in that position. So for someone like a gymnast, you might want to actually train spinal flexion, and there's exercises like the Jefferson curl that was popularized by the Chinese gymnastics team to do just that. So when we start to think more about training positions and looking at our goals and figuring out where we need to be strong and what different positions we need to be strong in, and start to focus on building strength in those positions instead of thinking about whether we're doing something right or wrong. It's going to go a long way, because right or wrong all depends on the context and the person. So all in all, it all comes back to this idea that no position is inherently dangerous if you're prepared to be in that position. And we see this in real life all the time, with people being able to get into pretty extreme positions over and over again safely because they've trained for that in their whole life. One example is if you ever watch the Olympics, especially the lighter females in the Olympic weightlifting, but when they catch their cleans, their butt is like on the floor, their knees are way out in front of their toes, and as soon as they initiate standing up from that position, their knees pretty much kiss, and then they fly back out, and then they stand up. And if you showed this to a new trainer, they would barf, and they'd be like, oh man, that person's knees are going to explode. But in reality, these people have very healthy knees most of the time. We also see this in a few other examples.
So if we have ever seen Shaun White snowboarding, after he goes off of a jump and lands, he crashes down to the ground from, I don't know how high, very high, with tons of force, and lands into extreme amounts of spinal flexion, and he lives to tell the tale. So we see people handling very, very high levels of force in what some would consider dangerous positions, and they're totally fine. And so if we bring that spinal flexion example back into the gym, if you're consistently lifting in a ton of extension and avoiding flexion at all costs, it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy that if you end up in a lot of flexion, that you might end up getting hurt. And that's not because flexion is a bad position, rather that this person has spent so much time avoiding it, and they're so concerned and obsessed about avoiding it that they aren't prepared to handle it. So again, to sort of circle back to what Paul was saying, it's not about a position being dangerous, but rather about that position being trained and your body being prepared to tolerate it.
And the whole point of this video is to help kind of squash some of these negative beliefs around technique. And those negative beliefs and expectations are going to have more of an impact on your risk for injury than actually doing the technique wrong. And that's a whole nother topic for another YouTube, but there's a lot of research in looking at people's expectations and beliefs around movements and their injury risk thereafter. So if you can really open your mind and think about this through a different lens, and kind of dive into the research and start to maybe think about your injuries and your technique and how they may not actually have been as related as you think they were, that would probably do you very good.